We are very excited today to have Lord Doves come to speak and give the topic on refugee children and their rights. And we've got a brilliant panel today as well. And I'll introduce them as and when I get to them. Just some sort of housekeeping matters. No fire drills, but if you do hear an alarm, the exit is, I think, there. And apparently one of us will, well, not me, lead everyone to the assembly point and to safety. And if someone is away from the room when the alarm sounds, they must just make their way out of the building, which is just go straight somewhere and then you find a door and you hopefully get out. Yes, I'm terrible at these things. So this lecture is going to be recorded, at least for the portion with the keynote and the panelists, and the question and answer session is going to be recorded only in audio. So I hope that's okay with everyone, because we don't want to get complicated consent issues going on. But without further ado, can I introduce you to our keynote speaker, Lord Doves. I don't think I really actually need to introduce him, but I will anyways. He's a Labour politician and a leading refugee rights advocate. He was MP for Battersea from 1979 to 1987, during which he served for 4 years as the Shadow Home Office Minister. After leaving the Commons in 1987, he became the director of the Refugee Council. I did not know that, and was appointed a Labour life peer in 1994. In 1997, after Labour's election victory, he was the Minister in Northern Ireland, and then in 2016, fast forward, he sponsored what we all now know as the Dobbs Amendment, which made a huge difference in giving some unaccompanied refugee children stranded in camps in Europe safe passage to Britain. He currently serves in the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly and the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He continues to campaign on human rights, and you will have seen and heard much of what he's been doing recently in the light of the conflict. Without further ado, can I introduce you to Lord Doves?
Well, good evening, and thank you very much indeed. I'm a bit awed by an audience of people who know more about the subject matter than I do, but I'm going to go ahead anyway. But it's an honour to be invited. Thank you very much indeed. I don't want to say much about my background at all, except this: that I think the argument on behalf of refugees should not depend upon the history of the individual putting forward the argument. But I suppose emotionally, I have a little bit more involvement. I want to say a bit about the history of this thing, of British policy as regards asylum seekers and refugees, especially child refugees. I want to say a little bit about the local situation when they do get here. I want to talk about the wider European issue and just mention the European Convention on Human Rights, which is also possibly going to be more of a talking point in the coming election, judging by the utterances of some of the senior ministers. Look, can I just say one thing about the Middle East, because I don't think I can stand here and not mention it. You know, I do believe they have to have a ceasefire. I don't think we're going to get anywhere unless we have a ceasefire. There has to be talking. I learned in Northern Ireland there has to be talking, because in the end there's no way of bringing a conflict to an end. And I just regret this. I also regret the fact that there's been a wave of increased anti-Semitism and Islamophobia stemming from the situation in the Middle East, which is utterly regrettable. And although I get my share of abuse, men get very little. Most of the abuse in public life is directed at women in public life. So there's a combination of racism and misogyny that go together. And it is absolutely horrific. And men in public life fairly well get off. I get a bit of this. I've had things like pity you survived the Holocaust and stuff like that. But most of it is of a much lower order than that which women in public life get. So I just say that for the record. So I came as a child. I was 6 years old, and English is my third language, and I think that's probably all I need to say about myself in that sense. Just can we remind ourselves a bit about the recent history? I'm going back to the 2016 Act, which is just following the conflict and the large movement of people out of Syria. And could I say, incidentally, that the amendment, you called it the Dubs Amendment. I never called it the Dubs Amendment. That was entirely the media. I couldn't stop it, and the media did that. But at any rate, when this bill was going through, and that was in 2016, I put down an amendment saying we should take, I think it was 3,000 child refugees. And I'm going to take you behind the scenes a little bit. So Theresa May was then the Home Secretary. And she said to me, she called me in, and I met her once before, and that's all. And she said to me, would I withdraw the amendment? And I said, I couldn't possibly. This is how things are done behind the scenes. And I couldn't possibly. I said, why should I? And she said, well, if these children come, others will follow. The amendment being about child refugees in Europe coming here. And I said, but we can't turn our backs on children who are sleeping rough in Calais or in various parts of Europe. So we parted company. Now, the amendment passed the Lords. I know we're an unelected House and we should be elected, but it passed the Lords. It was slightly defeated in the Commons. We had to change the wording a bit. And then something extraordinary happened. And that is public opinion suddenly woke up to what was going on. And public opinion through television screens, through seeing a Syrian boy drowned on the Mediterranean beach, Alan Kurdi, and suddenly people became aware of what was going on. And they became aware, more importantly, of the background, the terrible persecution, the war, the threats to the individuals who were seeking safety, a small handful of whom were the subject matter of the amendment, because most of them were in France and Germany and so on. And I was in the street and somebody shouted. Now, normally when they shout at politicians, it's abuse. In this case, it said, keep going with your amendment. And I was gratified by that. Then the government assured me they would accept the letter and spirit of the amendment because with public opinion, the government then said they would concede. So they did concede. But as for the letter and spirit of the amendment, they cut back the numbers arbitrarily to 480. And they did that because they said that local authorities can't find any more foster families. And with the help of Safe Passage, an NGO I worked with, we tested this proposition and we found 1,500 foster families willing to take child refugees. And then in the course of all this, I'll mention this story, there was a JR about the way in which child refugees are being handled. And the NGO said, please, would I go to the High Court and sit in so it would help? Well, I couldn't imagine why it would help. But anyway, I went in, and the Home Office official who saw me coming in gave me the least enthusiastic smile I've ever had in my life. Anyway, and then what disconcerted me more was the judge then picked me out and praised me and said it was good that politicians who were talking in Parliament also came to have a look and see what's happening here. Anyway, I didn't know judges could do that, picking individuals sitting there, but however. Anyway, so we had the 480 and they came. Then came perhaps an equally important issue, which was that under the EU, there's something called the Dublin Treaty, under what we call Dublin III, there is a provision whereby a refugee child in one EU country can apply to join family in another. So a Syrian boy in Paris could apply to join an uncle in Birmingham. And we're concerned that as we left the EU, another British disaster, as we left the EU, I mean, leaving the EU is a disaster, not the EU, I make it clear. There was a problem. And so I got an amendment down which ensured that Britain would negotiate to continue the provisions of that Dublin Treaty as far as children were concerned, even after we left the EU. And that was put into that passed, got in the 2017 Act, and then came the 2019 Act, and they took it out. And I was pretty incandescent about that. Anyway, to mollify me, they arranged a meeting. So I went to a meeting, and there were 3 government ministers and 7 officials. So I thought odds of 10 to 1 were about fair, given that I had the argument. Anyway, and the immigration minister said, look, he said, everything will be all right. The children will come anyway, even without your amendment. So he said, don't you trust me? So I lied and said yes. But I said, I don't trust the government. In any case, I said to him he would shortly be moved on to another job, which he was. I think he's not in the job at all now. Anyway, as a result, very few of the children came. In the meantime, I visited Calais a few times, and I'd. Have any of you been to Calais? And I had a look at this. Yeah. Well, when the camp was still half there was a shopping street, and there were displays of tear gas canisters and rubber bullets. And I said, "What are they for?" And they said the then French government was so concerned about the activities of the National Front that they used all these weapons to clear half the camp. To which I could only say, well, you don't defeat fascism by behaving like fascists. I'll come on to the far right a bit later on. Anyway, I visited some refugee camps in Greece as well, on Lesbos and even in Jordan. One of the things that struck me most was that in these camps, in working in very difficult conditions, were quite a large number of volunteers, not all British, but predominantly British, who were giving up a year or two of their lives to actually help their fellow human beings. And I thought that was pretty terrific, because we don't often see much said in praise of the volunteers, and I think they deserve all the credit they can get, as do the NGOs who work in the field, NGOs like Safe Passage, with whom I've been associated, or the Refugee Council. I also found the faith groups were pretty welcoming. Faith groups wanted to hear about refugees, and I'm a humanist, but nevertheless, the faith groups were pretty supportive. And of course, the best audiences of all the schools, because I found that talking to school kids, they get it. They get it just like that. And I think that is pretty gratifying. In fact, sometimes I've had a job persuading them not to quit school and become volunteers in the camps. But that sort of enthusiasm and commitment is great. All along, I've been anxious that the campaign on behalf of child refugees should not be the property of one political party. I've felt all along that we have to get support from wherever we can. And indeed, at one point, while the arguments about one of these amendments were going on, two government ministers came up to me and said, "Keep going with your amendment." And I said, "But you can't say that, you're a government minister." They said, "No mind, keep going." So there was support, but of course, not enough. And that's been one of the problems. And the basic argument is that if there are no safe and legal routes to get to safety, then the traffickers have a field day, the traffickers exploit the situation, and at the moment, I believe that there are no safe and legal routes open at all, or virtually none except from Ukraine. Now, one of the things that has been deeply shocking has been the language used by some governments. I can say, I don't have to be tactful, Suella Braverman's language has been appalling. To call asylum seekers invaders. Invaders are the enemy of a country. And these people are not the enemy. These people are the victims of wars, persecution, and terrible threats to their safety. And to call them invaders is not only insulting, but it also shakes my faith in whatever faith I ever had in the Home Secretary, which was pretty well nil at that point. And it makes me feel that this is intended to achieve some end. She also talked about people going on the demos recently as supporting hate crime. This is not right. And the danger is that when senior people make comments like that, then the willingness of the public to be supportive in local communities is probably lessened. And at the moment, I think there is a real battle for public opinion. And the outcome of that battle will help to influence the sort of policy we will have later on. For example, during the referendum campaign, I probably knocked on as many doors as anybody you know, but that's just because that's the sort of person I am. And I was mainly in the Remain area, but there was a woman who said she was going to vote Leave, and I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because of these refugees, people coming." She didn't say refugees, people coming. And I said, "But look, I'd had a very small procedure in a local hospital for half a day. And I said, everybody who treated me was an immigrant or an asylum seeker. Where would we be without them?" And she said significantly, "It's not those that are here already that bother me. It's the ones that are poised to come." Fast forward to Boris Johnson saying, if we don't leave the EU, 70, 80 million Turks are poised to enter the country, which is a complete lie. Now, can I turn to the most recent the most recent legislation, the Illegal Migration and Asylum Act, passed over one or two other bits of legislation. And that is probably the worst bit of legislation in a series of acts of parliament to damage the position of refugees, especially child refugees. And you will know, and by the way, we passed 20 amendments against the government to this. Of course, there were always one exception, they were all overturned in the Commons, even though we went on till pretty late, some days till 4 in the morning, and certainly quite often till midnight, trying to do battle. But in the end, they outvoted us, and the thing has become law. And not only do we have the pernicious Rwanda policy, which is still subject to the Supreme Court decision, which is going to come in the next month or two, but we also had established the government's view that anybody who comes by boat, who does not come by an approved route, cannot claim asylum. A total breach of the 51 Convention. The UNHCR say that that's not acceptable. But of course, our government knows more than UNHCR, although UNHCR is the custodian of the Geneva Convention. And then it's a criminal offence to bring people over by boat and so on and so forth. Now, can I just say a little bit about the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court on Human Rights? I served twice on the Human Rights Committee in Parliament, Joint Committee on Human Rights, and we went to Strasbourg. And the most recent visit was about a year ago, and it was interesting. They thought we were great as a country. They said the relationship between the European Court of Human Rights and the British courts is better than that between the European Court and any other country. That we were, after all, the founders of the European Convention on Human Rights, and they felt we should hang on in there because it was important. They also said that if we distance ourselves from the European Court of Human Rights and the European Convention, which after all some government ministers have been suggesting, if we distance ourselves, then the notorious abusers of human rights will say, well, if the Brits don't stick with it, why should we? So that the knock-on effect of our distancing ourselves will be even greater than just the effect on human rights in this country. And I can only say that we'll have to see what's in the government manifesto for the next election. But I'm alarmed at the voices that are saying we should depart from or distance ourselves from or be prepared to ignore the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. We did it once on prisoner releases, which was really quite extraordinary, because the countries that did not give prisoners the vote at that time all immediately adhered to the decision, except that we, for some reason, didn't want to do it. And they didn't even say that everybody had to be given the vote in a British prison. It simply said we shouldn't deny all the people the vote, so we should allow some of them. At any rate, the government has been in a panic about the boat crossings. And although nobody can defend the evil of the traffickers and organizing it and the result of people drowning, I was at the British Embassy in Paris, where they had quite a bright Home Office official who was looking at the policy. And of course, he said, just be careful. He said, the French are much more concerned about the far large number of people crossing the Mediterranean to their south coast than they are about what's happening in the Channel. So we've got to get it in perspective. However, it is still a nasty business. And I think the only way forward is really to have a better arrangement with the French, which I want to come on to in a moment. But of course, the people coming on a boat are more visible to the television cameras. Previously, they came on the back of a lorry, where they were not so visible. And so the hiatus in the media and the government statements and the government commitment to stop them all has of course featured very, very largely. We are, after all, in relation to our size of population, we are 17th out of 18th EU countries in taking asylum seekers. So the thing has been a bit blown out of perspective, particularly as a number of asylum seekers, at most 45,000, is very small in relation to the total number of immigrants coming into the country. And the danger is that the popular media and indeed some government ministers tend to confuse immigration with asylum. Can I just say a word about that? Asylum seekers are entitled to the protection of the Geneva Convention, an international human rights edict. Immigrants are not, but they're still entitled to human rights, but they're not subject to that international protection. And any distinction between the two should surely emphasize the human rights basis for asylum seekers, even though every country is entitled to take migrants and should do it in relation to its job market and its job needs. And indeed, with the number of job vacancies that there are in many of our industries, I think we could do with taking a few more. But I do say this, that I think in terms of policy, we would be better off if we shared responsibility across Europe and so we all should share responsibility. When 1 million Syrians arrived in Germany in 2015, 16, 17, Angela Merkel pleaded for other countries to share responsibility, and nobody did. And there's been a reluctance to do it, a bit more in the EU now, but certainly we don't play a great part in this. Now, can I just turn to Ukraine? I'm going to give you an example. There was a brief period when Ukrainian children could apply for a visa. Okay. 2 years ago, I think, a year and a half ago. And I'm talking about a girl I shall call Valia, although she's just typical of others. And this is an issue which incensed me as much as any. So Valia applied for a visa, and the Home Office said no. There was the local MP for the host family said they'd been on to the MP, and the MP said, can't do it. The Home Office have said no, and in case the Ukrainians won't allow it. Well, I don't normally try and second guess the constituency MP, but I felt I had to this time. And I got onto the Ukrainian embassy. They said if the parents didn't mind, they had no objection. And the Home Office still said there wasn't enough safeguarding. Now, Valia was 16 or 17. Her father was fighting. Her mother was right in the east, looking after elderly parents who were disabled. And Valia, 16, 17-year-old, still in a war zone, was so frightened on her own, she locked herself in her room and didn't dare go out. The Home Secretary, that's Priti Patel, apparently said that the safeguarding means that she better stay in Ukraine than come here. The family who were going to be the host family had been vetted, the school had been vetted, the local authority was happy. It was gold-plated vetting, and yet the Home Secretary said a child should stay in a war zone. Anyway, there was a junior minister I met him, I raised this time and time again, including in private meetings, and he made it clear it was the Home Secretary who was blocking it. And I said, well, what can I do? He said, shout at me. Anyway, the happy ending is that I did shout. The happy ending was that she did come. And I last met her with her host family, and she was just doing her A-levels, having not spoken very much English when she came. So there's a nice outcome to that. One of the challenges we have is how we deal with new arrivals. I'm going to give you a little story. Just before the pandemic, the Fulham and Chelsea football foundations decided they would have an evening giving football training to refugee boys. Now, I didn't challenge that it wasn't girls, because I felt there's so many arguments you can't have at the same time. But it was Guy Lineker who did it. And on the hallowed ground of Fulham football ground, in the floodlighting, there was this group of Syrian boys, mainly Syrian, some were Afghan boys, who were having football training supervised by Guy Lineker. Fantastic. If when I was their age, I'd have given anything to have that opportunity. But the point was to give them an opportunity and to give them a chance to see. Well, it wasn't normal to be for boys to play on Fulham football ground, but to give them a chance. But the issue is that one has to help, I believe, arrivals to be as normal as possible. That's to say, to fit in and do the things kids like to do, and do the sport things and all that. After all, of the asylum seekers that have come here, the children, almost without exception, say they want to continue their education, which they've missed badly through long, arduous journeys, perhaps 6 month or year journeys, traveling from Afghanistan or Syria. And the adults, of course, want the right to work. Can I just say something very quickly about I lost count of the time. Okay, you're going to kick me.
I'm not kicking you.
Anyway, a little story about mental health. Now, I'm not an expert in mental health at all, but I was offered by the Royal College of Psychiatrists a doctor who was studying to qualify mental health. And so I had her 1 day a week for a year. And what I asked her to do was to go to local authorities and interview them about the nature of mental health support for child refugees. There had been a tragic instance where 2 child refugees in South London had committed suicide, and there's a great concern about the vulnerability of young people. And so she went around and she looked at this, And the answer was there's a patchwork of support. In some local authorities, it's quite good. The social workers know what they're about. In others, they're not good at all. And in others, they don't have enough experience and so on. And we came up with a number of recommendations to try and raise the profile and to try and get it done better. Mind you, there was one boy who said, please don't treat me as a mental health problem. I want to play football. I want to go to school. I don't want to be a mental health problem. So the danger is we can all zoom in and say, because you've been through these awful experiences, you're bound to need mental health support. You may or you may not. And the difficulty is that where they don't speak English, you can use an interpreter to say, what do you want to eat? Or do you want to play football? But to use an interpreter to go into the more nuanced position of mental health is very difficult because, unless the interpreter is pretty good at this, so one has to be careful. Nevertheless, I flag mental health up. I talked to some local authority leaders, and they said to me, apart from cash, which is the obvious number one problem, they said to me that mental health was actually the thing that concerned them most. And then we have the terrible situation with the barge in Portland and the anxieties that has caused, and of course the threat that people will be sent to Rwanda. Say this. That I think how we deal with asylum seekers, especially with children, will test the sort of country we are and will test whether we actually have the humanitarian principles which we keep saying we have and which in the past we have had. So I think we need a Europe-wide policy. I don't think one country can sensibly deal with this on its own. And I think European cooperation is what is needed. Now we're in a weaker position to do that, but I think we still have to try. The other difficulty, and I mentioned it in relation to the tear gas and rubber bullets in Calais, the other difficulty is this, that we've seen that across Europe, sadly, in a number of countries, extreme right-wing political parties are exploiting the situation to get votes, cheap votes. And unfortunately, they've had some successes. In Germany, it resulted in Angela Merkel losing the leadership there. We've seen it in Slovakia just recently. Hungary was always like this. We've seen it in Austria. We've seen it in Italy. We've seen it in France. And there is a real threat. There's a real threat that even though when I argue there should be Europe-wide cooperation, that cooperation will become more difficult if extreme right-wing political parties become more dominant and have more influence in various continental countries. Because however we predict the future, given climate change, given more population movements because of that, given that there's no sign of war and oppression lessening, we've got to get accustomed to the fact that there will be more movements. And that is why it is crucial, it is absolutely crucial that we try and lead public opinion and ensure that public opinion understands the issue. If, as I said earlier, if the public are aware of the terrible situation that young people, particularly young people, have gone through in the countries from which they fled, then the public will be more sympathetic and will understand the arguments better. And very briefly, I'll just say this: we are, in addition to asylum seekers or refugees who fled for safety to another country, there are of course far more people who fled for safety in their own country and are internally displaced, and they regrettably don't have any international protection. We also are reliant upon television cameras to tell us more about what's going on, and so we've forgotten that there are 1 million Rohingyas who fled Myanmar into Bangladesh and living in terrible conditions. We tend to forget that there are many refugees here not allowed to work and who are waiting a long time for a decision about their status, which again is really ridiculous. So looking into the future, I think climate change will result in more movements. I think the wars and persecution that go on, sadly, will result in more movements. I think the far right in Europe will make this thing more difficult. And I think there is a danger that the government will want to stop the boats into an election issue, which I think would be damaging. I'm more in favor of public debate about these issues, but I think to stop the boats, to make it an election issue, it will be detrimental. So I'm pretty depressed about the situation. I don't think it's beyond hope, and I want to use the word hope in a minute, because I went to the refugee camp in Jordan, better than most, because it had sanitation, 70,000 refugees in it. It had sanitation, it had electricity and decent prefab buildings. But I was talking to a young Syrian boy, and he just finished his education in the camp, which was good. But he tried to find a job in the camp and he couldn't. He tried to find a job outside the camp and he couldn't. And he was frightened of going back to Syria, 40 miles away from where he was. And he had no hope. And it made me think, it's the lack of hope. Human beings can put up with appalling conditions if there's some hope at the end of the line. And one of the things we can do is to give them hope. And that's why I'm happy to go on campaigning on behalf of child refugees. They need a sense of hope more than anybody else. And I think public opinion has to be alert. You're part of public opinion. We can all do it. We can all make this a better country and we can have better policies. A change of government will not be ideal. I will say we'll still be shouting at them, but it'll be from a better position than we are now.
Thank you so much, Lord Darbs. That was, yeah, I have hope. Next, we move on to our panelists, and we're really fortunate to have three amazing panelists providing different perspectives on the same issues. Could I introduce you firstly to Hilda Opoku, who's a young woman who came to the UK unaccompanied. And she currently is studying law and aspires to be a human rights lawyer at Aston University. Today's the first day that I've met Hilda, but I have known Hilda through my case papers and all that, and have had the privilege of being a part of her legal team. So could we welcome Hilda to the panel? Before I hand over to Hilda, could I just ask that if you are going to take any photos or anything like that, to hold off on posting any photos on social media during this part of the session?
Hi, good evening. It's nice to be here, and thank you to the organizers for making me part of this huge project. I would like to talk about the topic refugee children and their rights. I came to the UK at the age of 14 unaccompanied. I came with a boy, I knew he was my brother. When we got to the immigration airport, they stopped us and they delayed us. The only thing they said was, I'm safe. They just wanted to know I'm safe. When I was coming, I thought I was going to live with my mom, but border control gave me to Manchester Children's Services. I asked them, why am I not with my mom? And they said, it's nothing. We are just doing some investigation. And I said, okay. I was first in Manchester and they moved me to Birmingham. Later, they came for my samples and the boy's samples as well. We were not together. So they took the samples to where he was and they did DNA. It turned out he was not my brother and my mom was not my mom. So Manchester Children's Services took the case to court, and the court ruled that I have to be in care till I'm 18. And after 18, Manchester still have a duty to support me till I turn 25. I was sad because I didn't know what was going on. Whilst my GCSE exams was also approaching, my foster carer, she advised me that I should just let everything go and focus on my books because that is my future. I did GCSE and I passed. A lady from Bonados, she was my personal advocate from Bonados, and she recommended a certain solicitor to me. He's called Tim. Tim decided to write to the immigration for them to give me a stay. So he did 2 applications. One is 4-year leave to remain, and one was indefinite leave to remain. The 4-year one was a the fact that I was in care. Immigration came back and they said they have granted me the 4 years leave to remain because I was a child in care. And when it is found out that a child who is in care cannot return back to their home country, they are supposed to give the child 4 years leave to remain. I was happy, but I didn't know the consequences of it. They rejected my indefinite leave to remain. They said because I was in care, the 4-year leave to remain is going to take me beyond my 18th birthday. So they rejected the indefinite leave to remain and said, I have the option of applying indefinite leave to remain after the 4-year leave has expired. However, they did not consider what I was going to do after I turned 18, because the problem started from there. When I was approaching the age of 18, I knew I wanted to go to university, but I didn't know what student finance was and the requirement. So I started doing research, and I realized that because of my stay, I wouldn't be able to get student finance money. So I started stressing. I was thinking that how am I going to get to uni? And my solicitor, Tim, said, okay, the fact that they have rejected my indefinite, there is still an option for me to apply for British citizen on a discretionary basis. He sent the application and the Home Office rejected it. They said, because I have limited leave to remain, they cannot grant me British citizen. I didn't know much about the law, but I always do research. And when I did some research, I knew they had the right to grant me British citizen because I was a child in care. And the fact that I had limited leave to remain doesn't mean I cannot have British citizen. So my solicitor called me back and said he's going to send the application back for them to reconsider it. So my A-level results was approaching. I had to apply for university. So we started talking to Manchester for them to pay for my fees. And one social worker said, oh, we are not paying. And I was like, okay. So I started losing hope. My mental health was at stake. And I did more research about children in care and their rights. And I realized Manchester has a duty to pay for my fees. So I talked to my solicitor about it, and he recommended a lawyer from London to have a talk with Manchester whether they are going to pay for the fees or not. So when he wrote to Manchester, Manchester said, we never said that. We said she should bring her the expenses. And I said, no, they didn't say that, because they said they were not going to pay and everybody was there. So they didn't say anything like that. And they went back and forth and they agreed to pay for my fees. And now I'm in first year of university studying LLB law at Aston. However, I feel like the Home Office, the policies do not consider what a child in care, on generally children who are at a disadvantage. They don't think about their future when they're making the rules or the laws. Because if not, I was in care and I had good people like my solicitor, my social workers, my foster carer, I wouldn't be in uni because I wouldn't know the route to go about it. So it will be very necessary for them to consider children's, when they are young, they should consider, when they're making decisions about their application, they should consider their future. The fact that still Manchester is paying for my fees, I still struggle with certain things because I was not eligible for student finance. So I was classified as an international student. And Manchester said, if you pay, you have to talk to the unit for them to classify you as a home student. I had to do more research, contact the school, tell them what the issue is. And finally they said, okay, because you are in care and you have links with the local authority, we are going to allow you to pay for home student fees. if a child who is not in care is facing similar situation like mine, how are they going to cope with this situation, and how is their dreams going to come true? Because it's very difficult if you don't have the support, because most children don't know their rights. They are not being, they normally they don't tell them what their right is. Manchester never told me that it's their right to pay for their fees. It took my solicitor and some research I did and Bonados who told me that Manchester is my legal parent-in-law, so they have to pay for it. So I think there should be more education on children and their rights, immigrants and their rights. Yeah, there should be more education on what they can access, where they can go, and immigration or the Home Office should also consider children who are at disadvantage. They shouldn't just make a rule, example, stating that I have 4 years leave to remain, whilst my solicitor clearly stated that I need the British citizen so that I can actually go to uni. Not only that, but also my connection to the UK. But all of this, they just refused, and they just said, because I have limited leave to remain, I'm not allowed to have a British citizenship. Yeah, but in all, I never gave up. I did my best. The fact that when I was writing my A-levels, I didn't have any hope that I was going to uni, because my social worker has already told me that they were not going to pay for it. I still worked hard. I just put it in my mind that, okay, even if I don't get into university, I'll be proud of my results. And on the 17th of August, I saw my results and I was happy. And at that time, a decision has been made by Manchester that they were going to pay for my fees as well. So it's good for children to know their rights, where they can go for help, explore the possible opportunity they can to make their lives better. I quite remember they told me I should go to my sixth form and appeal for funds. And I told the lady, I'm not going to do that. And she said, you have pride? And I said, no, I don't have pride. I'm just saying you pay for my fees because this is my right and you have to. But still they refused not to pay. It took my solicitor to contact a barrister in London for them to speak to Manchester Children Trust, for them to agree they are going to pay for it. So it's good for a child or a child at a disadvantage to know their rights and who will be there to help them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. Our next speaker is Mariam Bafo from We Belong. She's the Policy and Public Affairs Officer there. And if anyone who doesn't know We Belong, it's an incredible organization that's young migrant-led, and they're committed to equal and fair treatment for all young migrants across the UK. Miriam leads the Chasing Status program, which holds the Home Office and many others accountable for all the barriers that prevent young migrants accessing services. So over to you, Miriam.
Thank you. I'm left speechless with Hilda's speech, but it really sheds light on the work that We Belong do. So the story in which Hilda was mentioning about the barriers in which she has to navigate is a story that is very familiar with the young people that we support. And with one of our programs is Let Us Learn. So it's campaigning for the rights for equal treatment for young people to access further education. So Hilda eloquently, articulates some of the barriers in which young people are facing. And for the Chasing Status, for We Belong, before We Belong actually was formed as an organization, it was young migrants campaigning for the rights to higher education. And then after experiencing a successful Supreme Court judgment highlighting discrimination in which young people are having to go through in trying to essentially being blocked from university, after the success for those young migrants, they realized that we also have the question, why are we placed in the situation that we're in? And the need for a systematic approach in addressing that. No young people should be going through this. So with We Belong, as mentioned, we are a youth-led migrant charity that exists for and by and for young migrants, and we call for an end to the hostile environment. And as mentioned by Hilda, is like also raising awareness around the barriers, but also letting young people know about like what are your rights and entitlement, because it's important with the cuts to legal aid. But I thought it would be good to structure my speech and really reflecting on the work of We Belong, our campaign success, and some of the issues, just highlighting examples of the issues that young migrants are facing. And it was really hard for me to narrow that down because, as you know, with the political landscape that we're currently operating in, there are many issues. So I will begin by explaining about the young people, the cohort of young people that we support. So the young people we work with migrated to the UK as a family unit during their childhood and remained in the country ever since. These are young people not claiming asylum, nor identified as refugees. For many reasons, including the lack of access to legal advice because of cuts to legal aid, the extortionate home office fees, and the complexity around the immigration law, which leads to many not being able to understand their rights and entitlement. Due to these barriers, many of these young people are unable to regularize their status. So these are the young people that contact us. And as they embark on their transition into adulthood and on their journey to mapping out plans for their future, the UK immigration system cruelly obstructs their path. Left with being told that they do not belong in the UK because they do not have the documents required to prove their legal right to stay here, and thus denied access to basic services. So for example, we see cases where a young person at the age of 18 would contact us to say they've applied to go to university, but have been classified as an international student. And despite some of them arriving in the UK when they're aged 4 months, age 4, 5 years, and considers the UK as their home, this is when they realize that there is an immigration issue in which they weren't aware of. And till this day, I find it really challenging to convey the profound damage inflicted on the young person's sense of belonging. And once they do realize, okay, I need to regularize my status, for this cohort of young people, when they do attempt to regularize their status, they would be eligible to something that's called limited leave to remain. So this is a limited form of status that is granted on the basis of the right to family or private life, which is protected under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So the young people were previously placed on what is known as the 10-year route to settlement, which is the longest route to settlement as part of the hostile environment agenda. An application for limited leave to remain for this young people costs around $2,600 per person. And over the course of the 10-year period, a young person is required to renew the application every 2.5 years. Provided that they maintain their status, then they would be eligible for permanent residence, which is also known as settled status, and which costs an additional application fee of $2,600. And the impact of having to go through this long route to settlement, for our young people, they describe their limited leave to remain process as feeling like you're on probation, never feeling like they belong, which further impacts their integration, ambitions put on hold, their well-being, the impact on their well-being, jobs prospects, and their ability to access basic services. And for some, they see themselves as locked in the fees and constantly feeling a sense of anxiety each time they make that application because of the fear of what if it's wrongly, what if it's wrongly processed. And for We Belong, we work towards raising awareness around how the UK immigration system is impacting young people. And I would say, based on my interaction with the young people, I would confidently say that the UK immigration system is failing young people and children. And the principles enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child is all well and good in theory, but in reality is not applied in practice. And the Home Office fails to adequately consider or conduct assessments of the impact of policies and laws on the lives of the children and young people. And this is where We Belong bridges the gap, because having realized that, yes, okay, the UK immigration system is failing young people and children, we can't just leave it there. And no longer can children and young people be left to the margins of society without protection. So for We Belong, advocacy is really key, and raising awareness, as mentioned, this is the route in which young people have to go through, but the public should be aware of the fees attached in order to maintain and obtain their status. So for 4 years, We Belong, with other organizations and young activists, has been raising awareness on the impact on the 10-year route to settlement for young people and children, calling for a shorter, more affordable route to settlement, building relationships with policymakers and politicians, because through evidence finding, they're able to build a case and also highlight what is the impact. Because a lot of time, even with myself, so when I'm engaging with the policymakers and the politicians, a lot of times they're not aware of the process in which those young people have to go through in order to maintain their status. So and I always say, it's like, avoid assumptions. Go for, like, explain what is the fees in which young people are required to pay in order to regularize their status. And in 2021, through building mobilization, getting young people to tell their stories, the government actually heard our concerns and shortened the 10-year route to settlement to 5-year route to settlement for young people and children. And this was a victory for us, because not only was it that we were seeing young people being at the forefront on the change in which they envisioned, the impact will be on a grand scale, because it's estimated that there are over 332,000 young people and children living in the UK with precarious immigration status. And the campaign when really sets the path in terms of, it's really important when we speak about children's right, it's the question as to where are the children, where are the young people, and what is it, the change in which you envision, and is this change in which you envision actually a change that will benefit the young people, and like, you know, avoid the barriers in which they have to go through. And winning this policy was not enough for We Belong. Winning the policy was all great, but it was looking at the implementation. So right now we are currently, like, you know, making sure that young people are aware of their rights and entitlement in order to benefit from this rule change. But yeah, at the same time, in terms of the recent policy development, we have seen the government introduce have basically increased the Home Office fees. That would essentially mean that, like, you know, there will be an increase of many young people not being able to afford the fees, because amidst the cost of living crisis, but also with the fact that it would increase people falling out of status because of the unaffordability. So we have launched that Out of the Loop campaign, which is really following from our previous campaign to say we want all young people to benefit from this rule change. So essentially, we're calling for a fee waiver and for the fees to be reduced to an affordable level. I will end there.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Next up is Antonia Benfield. I think most of you don't need any introductions to her, but she has been working across the field of immigration, asylum, public law, and a whole gamut, or specializing in representing refugees and particularly unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. She manages somehow to also find time to be a trustee at West London Welcome. She's worked for a vast number of different refugee organizations, including Refugee Council. And over the last 17 years, this is an area that she has been passionate and committed to. So over to you, Antonia.
Thank you. I'm conscious that after Lord Dubbs's concluding words of optimism and Hilda's inspirational story, I might be concluding on a slightly depressing note. But what I wanted to do, I suppose, is pick up some of the points that Lord Dubbs raised about the trajectory of the legal framework, particularly around immigration legislation, and how we're seeing essentially a regression in the progression of the rights of refugee children. And really what amounts to a backstep from the concept of child first and migrant second. What we're seeing is a real primacy being given to immigration control and additional barriers, some of which Mariam and Hilda have spoken about, in relation to refugee children realising their rights. So regrettably, there are many issues that come out of the Nationality and Borders Act of 2022, the Illegal Migration Act of 2023. But in the time, I just wanted to pick up on 3 examples. The first is the introduction of a power for the Secretary of State to essentially age assess a child for the purpose of immigration control. So nothing to do with their rights as a child, but in relation to immigration enforcement. The second, again, on the theme of age assessment, but the introduction of scientific methods around age assessment and what that means in terms of the rights of children. And the third issue I wanted to conclude on is the introduction of a statutory power for the Secretary of State to accommodate and support children outside the Children Act framework. So as I say, none of it is positive, it's all rather bleak, but I suppose, as Lord Dubbs says, these are the kinds of issues that we need to get public opinion behind if we're going to support refugee children in terms of realising their rights. So as I say, the first issue relates to age assessment for immigration purposes. And of course, the Home Office has always had the power to make a decision on a young person's age when they arrive in the UK. But the conduct of age assessments as we understand them has to date been a function of local authorities under child protection and safeguarding systems. But what is being brought in its Section 51 of the Nationality and Borders Act is an ability for the Home Office to require age assessment when determining how to exercise their immigration functions. So what the Act creates is a body called the National Age Assessment Board, which is staffed by social workers, but it's the Home Office. It's a department of the Home Office, it's overseen by the Home Office, albeit that they will be separate from individuals who have immigration decision-making functions. And of course, the immediate concern about that is not only the impartiality and whether it can be right that assessments that are being conducted for immigration purposes are being conducted by the Home Office itself, but also about a child's perception of impartiality, which seems to be something that seems to have fallen out of any discussion about this issue. The Act, I think fair to say in collective view of people that are concerned about this development, is a significant overstep on local authorities. Though they are the ones who should be tasked with assessment of age. And even beyond that, what the Act provides is even where a local authority has assessed the age of a young person and accepted it, or even where a local authority has worked with, accommodated, looked after a young person for a period and decided, well, we can accept age without even having to assess, the Home Office can compel them to do so. And that's why I say a significant overstep. And of course, there are multiple problems with this. We could probably discuss this all evening. But picking up, I suppose, on three, looking at matters from the child's perspective primarily, is first, a significant uncertainty, I suppose, in fact, leaving the child in limbo as to whether their age is accepted or not. Everybody who works with unaccompanied children, age-disputed young people, know that the profound detriment psychologically of being left in this period of uncertainty and not being able to act as one of your peers. The second is exacerbating the lack of trust in authority and in professionals, which is something that young people need, and everybody well knows the detriment to young people in this consistent feeling of being disbelieved. And the third is the risk of re-traumatizing children who have already, to a local authority, gone through and told their accounts, recounted their trauma on their journeys and in their home countries, and making them retell that again through multiple assessment, but just for immigration purposes. And it's difficult to see how this sits with the Home Office's duty to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. It's difficult to see how this sits with the principle that age assessment should only be conducted where there's a need to do so, whether there's a doubt as to age. The Home Office guidance says that it's expected that these types of assessments, so for immigration purposes alone, are likely to be rare, but that remains to be seen in circumstances where the guidance is pretty broad in terms of the categories of children who could be subject to them. So the second point I wanted to pick up on is the use of scientific methods in age assessment. This is also within the Nationality and Borders Act 2022, but it's Section 52. And it will see the use of scientific methods being introduced around age assessment, the provisions due to come into force later this month, but associated regulations are still being debated. But what the current proposal is that unaccompanied children whose age is disputed can be the subject either of X-ray or MRI screening, not to replace the social work assessment, but essentially to act alongside it. And what is proposed is that a scientific method will be conducted. It will give a range, so young person is between 16 and 18, and that's to inform the assessment. I suppose when considering this development, it's important to put it in context. The use of scientific methods and the controversy around it is not new. The legal and ethical justifications, as many of you will know, is something that's been debated for decades. And this is where we see, again, this regression and backstep into matters that have been discussed and one had hoped, I suppose, had been laid to bed many years ago. But X-rays were used primarily 70s and early 80s was the beginning, and then stopped at that time when they were deemed to be of little value beyond other methods. In 2007, we then saw, it was based upon the increase in arrivals, the government publishing a consultation about bringing in X-rays under the immigration rules. And at the time, the government said, well, these could be an additional reliable method. This brings us in step with other EU member states. And for those of you who followed this issue, that is exactly what the government is saying again now. The responsible bodies at the time, so 2007, if one looks at what the Royal College of Radiologists, the British Dental Association, and Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health said, it was all vigorously opposed. And there have been instances over the years where, again, this has been raised, again, it's been debated and never brought in. And it's within that context that the provision in the Nationality and Borders Act needs to be considered, and the strongly voiced opposition from specialist NGOs, from medical bodies, from the social work profession. And there's been much debate on reliability and why this is concerning, but I suppose I wanted to pick up on, I've been given a 2-minute warning as well, so I want to pick up on a couple of the concerns, again, from the kind of the child's perspective. The first is, of course, probably an obvious one, the ethical implication of subjecting children to radiation for non-medical purposes. And it's right to say that Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health are unequivocally of the view that it's unethical. In fact, contrary to what the government would have us believe, the EU Commissioner of Human Rights says the same. This is something that's ethically dubious. There's also a complete lack of research in relation to the experience of refugee children, so their countries, the ethnicities, their backgrounds, the impact of all of this. There's just simply no research on it. There's concerns about re-traumatization of children, and something that probably is a discussion we could all have in itself, about questions of consent and how that is ever intended to operate. But given I've had a 1-minute warning, I'm going to skip past that. To deal with the final point, which brings us kind of more broadly to unaccompanied children, not just those who are age disputed. With the Secretary of State bringing in, this is the Illegal Migration Act to 2023, Section 16, a power for the Secretary of State to accommodate and look after children. The provisions, thankfully not yet in force, but the intention is there. And a significant change from local authorities and local authorities alone, being those who look after children. And many of you may be aware of the ECPAT UK litigation that raised concerns about over 5,000 children and being accommodated by the Home Office and everything that went with that, with children going missing and exploited, etc. And rather than really reflecting on that, the government seems to consider it more appropriate to give themselves a statutory power to look after children. Of course, remains to be seen how and when that power comes into force, if it is. But again, I said, just to conclude, I suppose it's part of the recent legislative developments that plainly fail to put children's best interests at the forefront, and immigration control above them. Thank you.
Well, that was brilliant. I think the whole panel and Lord Dubs has given us quite a lot of food for thought. But turning it over to the audience members to see if you have any questions, comments. If you raise your hand, a microphone hopefully will come your way. And then if you could just identify who you are, if you have an organization or affiliation, just identify that, and then who you're asking the question to, or you can ask the question to all of the panelists.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kavita Mohanty. Firstly, I must say, Lord Dubs, thank you so much for such a remarkable speech. And Hilda, I commend your fearlessness. It has been truly inspirational to hear your story. Thank you. My question is to Antonia. Considering that you deal with situations that can be extremely demanding and emotionally taxing, can you tell us about any case where the outcome wasn't what you hoped that it would be? And how did you deal with that? And what did you learn about resilience? Because I think the work that you and Shu do, for that matter of fact, as barristers, resilience will be an important aspect. Thank you.
Should we take two or three questions and then turn to the audience? Anybody else? Aoife.
Thank you very much. I mean, a series of absolutely brilliant and gripping panelist presentations and really a wonderful talk from Lord Dubbs. Thank you so much, Alf. I want to ask a question. There's been a lot of talk this evening about rights, about the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think it's very important to sit back and also bear in mind the particular domestic context in which we're sitting in which it's quite clear there's a Supreme Court who is, at best, shall we say, ambivalent about the notion of domestic standards being read through a progressive children's rights lens, say the UNCRC, even where there's the opportunity to do so. For instance, in the context of Article 14, cases involving Article 14 or Article 8 under the ECHR and the Human Rights Act. And I mean, my question is for anyone on the panel who wants to answer it, is what we're seeing here, while we talk about children's rights, is in fact what we're seeing here ultimately a huge failure or evidence of the huge failure of children's rights to actually have meaningful traction in the UK context? And I'm sure everyone has a thought on it, but so it's whoever wants to have a go or not.
Great, well, I think there's one more question and then we'll turn to the panelists.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Jane. I'm from the UK's National Preventive Mechanism. I am curious about the National Age Assessment Board and the inversion of immigration procedures over rights of the child, and how that, if it is to be staffed by social workers, is that not a contradiction in kind of their vocation and the role that they would there be filling? And I'm very behind, and I don't know if that is already set up and running and if it's staffed, so I'd be very curious to hear more about that.
Great. I mean, should we start with you, Antonia, on resilience? It's called chocolate, but if we can start with that.
Yeah, and I think very good question. I suppose, yes, of course, not every case goes your way. I suppose all of us that work on cases, I suppose all cases, but cases involving children's rights is, you keep going with it as far as you can until you win. And you keep going, even if the court doesn't go your way, and you try and go as far as you can and you try and be successful. And I had actually, I suppose, a good example recently of an Eritrean young woman who came here unaccompanied. She was age disputed, and we took the case to the High Court, and the High Court says no, and you take the case to the Court of Appeal, and finally you get a judge, and you guess you just have to keep going. There are cases, of course, where you come to the end of the line, which is horrible. Of course it is. But I guess the only way you deal with it is to know that you've done the very best that you can at all stages, and unfortunately, sometimes you just can't quite get there. And then console yourself with chocolate, Shushin says.
Lots of it.
Lots of chocolate.
I mean, I guess resilience is something that links up with everything that all the panelists and Lord Dubbs you do in Parliament, and in repeatedly introducing amendments that would confer more rights, more protections, raising awareness. Could we get your kind of perspective on resilience, hope, how we keep going?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll do my best, but may I just comment briefly first on the age assessment point? A few years before the pandemic, I was approached by a family, and they had a 15-year-old Syrian girl they were looking after, and she was summoned to Luna House for an age assessment. I hope the method has got better since then, but she took the girl to Luna House. They would not let her go in. She was interviewed by Home Office officials. A criminal child would have had somebody with them. She had nobody with them. She was interrogated, and she came out absolutely distraught. And I complained to Home Office about it. I didn't get anywhere with it. And it just seemed to me this was a denial of all the rights of children. I believe that a child accused of a criminal offence would have the right to have a parent or a lawyer or somebody with them. In this case, she had absolutely nothing because she was just a Syrian girl who they thought was older than she was. And I thought that was a supreme example of how to take rights away from children and treat them much worse because they were refugees or migrants than they would have done if they'd been just other children. So to me, and the other point is, look, we've got to keep going because there are so many I get a lot of the publicity because of all the way the media work, but it just seems to me that there are so many good people involved. We've heard some today, but also in the NGO world. I pick out Safe Passage and the Refugee Council, but there are others as well, and all the volunteers. There's so many good people involved. And somehow that keeps those of us in politics going because, they come to us, could we do this? And it would mean turning our backs on some great people who are doing it without any benefits to them in terms of publicity or anything else. And the least we can do is to go on doing it and go on advocating the case. And I think that's the least that could be expected of us. And the colleagues and I are trying to do that.
And Miriam?
I would say in terms of resilience, with as mentioned, with the political landscape that we're operating in is very daunting, but hope is essential, especially if for We Belong, we always say injustice is an injustice for everyone. So when we're working towards imagining the alternative, it's also understanding how can we make sure that everyone's on the same playing field. And I would say the biggest concerns right now is that when we speak about rights, we want that to be, when we speak about children's rights, we want it to be applied to all. But we also have to look at the environment in which we're operating and knowing the fact that young people are being denied the access to these rights. And with the costs, as I mentioned about the high fees, my biggest concern is that there is a price tag towards the rights of, for young migrants to actually access these rights. And we have to stand against that. And it's essential for us to not just only wait for those who are policymakers to come to their senses and realize, hey, this is not great, but it's for us to demand that. And that is through building a case and building the momentum on the ground and working collaboratively with the politicians, with the policymakers, because we can't just assume that they will understand what the day-to-day experience. We have to be in the room to say this is the change in which we want, and also to make sure that and holding them to account. So I would say hope is essential, but it's also making sure that you're building coalition, work, building relationship with the communities in which you intend to serve, but also making sure that you're in the rooms when decisions are being made.
And Hilda, do you have a view? How do you kind of keep going when you get knocked back, when you meet difficulties with your immigration case, when you have to fight with Manchester to get university fees paid? I mean, what motivates you? How do you keep going?
I would say if you know your dreams, you know what you want, you never give up. Example is like me waking up every morning 6 o'clock. The bus stop is 7 minutes away from my house. Sometimes I leave home 3 minutes for the bus to come. I run so fast, I don't stop because I know when I stop, I'm going to miss the bus. That's how whenever Manchester comes up saying we are not going to pay, if the immigration say, okay, we are not accepting your application, I still know I wanted to become somebody in the future. So I never gave up. I just fight. Never give up. That's it. Don't give up. Just fight till the battle is done. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I lost track because I'm so inspired by everybody's questions. But I think there was a question about the National Age Assessment Board, and that's you, Antonia.
Yes, it is operational. And essentially, they're social workers. They're social workers who are registered with social working, and they have the same professional obligations and service standards as every other social worker. They're just employed by the Home Office. So, I agree. There's a tension because they're working. We know that the Home Office's policy position is that there are all of these adults who are pretending to be children. We know that that is the trajectory that the Home Office is going down, but at the same time, these social workers are meant to be working independently, but under the policy guidance of the Home Office. It is really problematic. I mean, anecdotally, I've heard from social workers with whom I work, and obviously there are some fantastic social workers, that social workers are really not keen to take jobs with the National Age Assessment Board, and they have huge vacancies and they're hiking up what they want to pay people, but the social work profession is generally being a bit resistant. But there are some who are willing to work within them. I mean, I think it's still slightly early stages in terms of how those assessments are going to stand up to scrutiny. Some are going through the courts, but I think, yeah, in time, we'll have to see. But it's problematic.
And I guess just picking up on Aoife, by the way, is the co-lead for the children's rights group at Battersea Street Chambers, and she's a real leading light in children's rights. But so just want to pick up on Aoife's question on the huge failures in children's rights at the moment, but perhaps looking at sort of how we swing public opinion, how do we galvanize? Because we can see what's happening. We can all talk about it, but to avoid just the echo chamber of talking about what's wrong with it, what do we need to do when we go away today and swing public opinion? I mean, do we just knock on doors? Do we corner people on dog walks and whatnot, which is what I do a lot on my free time? What do you think we as a group can do?
I suppose you have to do everything, everything you can think of. There's no one answer. Somebody asked me this once, and I said, referring to Guy Lineker and what he did and the stand he took, and he got into trouble with the BBC. But anyway, I said we need more Guy Linekers. But that's a facile answer, although it's true. I think what we have to do is to let our voice be heard, not just among sympathetic audiences. We have to actually let our voice be heard among people who are not that sympathetic, people who ask more difficult questions. For example, they say, one of the ones that's difficult is, what about housing? They say, we're short of housing anyway. How are we going to house all these people coming in and so on and so forth? So there are all sorts of quite difficult questions which we've got to be able to get on top of. But I think we've got to spread the word. And I think, I repeat myself now, the key argument is that if people knew what the asylum seekers have been through, if they knew what their horrific experiences were, then I think the sympathy would be there, and I think more sensible policies could more easily step in. So I see public opinion as being very important. For example, they say, why are all these Afghans, why are they just boys and not girls? And the answer is very simple. The Taliban, before they took complete control, the Taliban went around insisting that families had to give their boys to join the Taliban army. A lot of families didn't want their sons to be fighting other Afghans, and so they clubbed together and they helped them to get out with money. And that's why they're mainly boys, and these things have to be explained to people. But above all, and the story is a Syrian boy who said to me he'd seen his father blown up in front of him by a bomb in either Aleppo or Damascus. How can anybody ever get over that in the whole of their lives? And we have to understand these are the sort of experiences which characterize what it is that people here who've got here have got to live with, and why we owe them a duty as fellow human beings.
And can I just get each member of the panel, if you've got a thought on what you think everybody else here can go away and do something to contribute to getting the public behind protection of children's rights. Should we start? Hilda, do you want to start? Or do you want to go last? You want to go last? Okay. So I'll come to you, Miriam, first.
I would say it's first, not this is great that we're discussing this, but it's not ending it here. And it's really, as we said, is building public support, is educating people. I would say education is very key in terms of raising awareness and like shedding light on the realities in which people have to go through. But it's also knowing the fact that there are movements happening. So it's like joining forces, extending your support in a way where if you're great at, and it's just like your skills and I would say it's, yeah, so it's joining a movement, raising awareness, talking about, because a lot of times when we are engaging with politicians and cross parliamentarians, they assume that they're speaking on behalf of their constituent. So it's really important for us to disrupt that and say, no, this is like, to stand together in a united approach. So yeah, that's mine.
Antonia?
I suppose picking up slightly on both what Lord Dubbs and Mariam have said, that it's, I suppose, firstly, working in partnership, and secondly, being informed and spreading that knowledge. And I feel like when I ever talk to people who have kind of anti-refugee sentiments or kind of naturally inclined to be slightly more right-wing, as Lord Dubbs says, if you ever explain, this is the circumstance that someone's been through, this is their experience, this is what this refugee child has gone through, everyone will all of a sudden say, oh my God, that's awful, this poor young child. But it's, I suppose, about humanizing it and sharing those stories with people to allow them to understand and affecting public opinion that way. And also picking up on what Mariam says, the importance of working in partnership and working across organisations, whether that's with NGOs or community groups or more broadly schools, as Lord Dubbs has said, I suppose in kind of unity and strength to look at the issue from lots of different angles.
And Hilda, you talked a lot about sort of like, if children need to know their rights. Yeah. So, so from your perspective, what do you think people can take away and do to help other children to have experiences and to be able to put up a good fight and get good results and have the dreams that you talk so passionately about?
Yeah. So I think not everyone knows their rights, and not all children can read, Google search about something, about laws. So I think it's all of us, our duty, not to say, okay, you're entitled to this, but give the person advice them about the law, tell them what they can access, what they are eligible for, what the law implies, what the law states. Make the child knows that he or she have a right to do something. I think it's all of us, our duty to make the world a better place. And talking to other children sometimes makes them feel better if they know what they can access, because not everybody can read. I have example, because I live in a foster care home. I used to have encounter with different children from different backgrounds, and some of them cannot read, some of them cannot write. So they don't know what they are eligible, they don't know what right they have to stay in the UK. So sometimes I tell them, okay, you can ask this from your social worker, you can do this, you can do this. So we're talking about it, not saying, okay, it's your right, but you can advise them where to get the help from. That would be very necessary as well. Yeah.
I think there's a question at the back.
Hello, good evening. Sorry, I'm not sure if there's enough time for one more question, but I just wanted to say, first of all, what a very inspirational set of talks this evening. Thank you very much for those. My name's Alcia. I'm from a company called Edge Training. We're a legal training company, and we deliver training to health and social care staff, including social workers that do assessments for no recourse to public funds. My question, well, two questions. First of all, is there a fact sheet of some sort where a young person, as Hilda described beautifully just now, could access all this information in one place? Is that something that you can maybe tell us about? I'm sorry if it was already covered, and we would be happy to distribute it to all the social workers we deliver training to. And the other question was really about more of a selfish request. If there's anyone here that would like to deliver training for us, they approach me at the end on that subject. I especially loved the way Antonia spoke so compassionately about assessing, because I think social workers do feel very conflicted, and we hear this all the time on training, that they struggle with the ethics of this. So that would be my second rather selfish request. Thank you.
Sorry, I suppose the other thing I wanted to I don't know if it's so much a question as a comment, sorry, it's Ethan Nolan again. I co-lead the Children's Rights Group with Shushin. is that I think it's very interesting that as we see what's happening in Gaza and what is effectively, at the very least, ethnic cleansing in real time at the moment, that I think we can all, well, many of us would accept as being allowed to happen because the people involved are not white, and the children who are dying in great numbers every day are not white. And I just want to flag that I think it's important that today we've spoken extensively about domestic failings or UK government failings when it comes to child refugees here, once they've got here. But I think we also, as we come away from this event, many of us will be bearing in mind and will be thinking about the fact that children coming here can sometimes result from failings in government policy that, for instance, in the Gaza situation, are failing to deal with very severe, massive children's rights violations in the country of origin. And we know that failures to secure the rights of children in their country of origin through pressure, the work of the international community, etc., will result an increase in child refugees here. And I think it's important to make that connection because, of course, everyone comes from somewhere and we're very lucky that people come here, but there needs to be an acknowledgement of what is as Alf was so clear in his speech, what is the driver of children leaving the places they're from and the people they love to come to the UK. So I just wanted to make that point. I'm not sure if speakers want to respond, but I think it's just important for us to bear in mind, we're looking at the tail end of things and looking back at the origins of why children are moving and why they will be moving from particularly that area as we move forward in the coming months and years.
Look, can I say thank you for saying that? I agree. And we have so many things to, as it were, criticize ourselves for, we and the Western countries generally. And we haven't, this is not an occasion to debate the whole of the Middle East, but if one looks at the history of it, we've totally copped out on this. We've just ignored it, and we've allowed the situation to develop, and now we're seeing most horrific things. And I'm afraid that is true in other countries as well. And we're not responsible for everything, but we're responsible for a lot more than we're prepared to admit. And we've got to do something about it. And I think we have a responsibility. But I think we also have a responsibility just for our fellow human beings, frankly. I know it sounds trite, it doesn't sound very exciting, but our fellow human beings are entitled to something from those of us that live in a very rich country.
So we're out of time for the panel, but not out of time for continued conversation with drinks and food in the back. But before we do, can I just say, I would like to say a really big thank you to Alf for coming and giving us such an inspirational speech, and all of the panelists for offering such insightful comments and perspectives, and for all of you for coming and asking great questions and listening, and hopefully it's going away from this taking back action points for swaying more public opinion. And last but not least, this event could not be possible without our marketing and our clerking team support. So thank you so much for that. We do this every year, so I hope to see you back here again around the same time next year. And in the meantime, let's keep the conversation going. Thank you very much.